Okay. Well, I want to sing a little prayer first. But I always say, don't get too holy just because I call it a prayer, okay? A prayer, it's Tibetan words, it's a little tune, and it's expressing a couple of thoughts. It's expressing thoughts, you know, and we're going to talk about the mind. The first thoughts, the first two lines can be for anybody in the room who already identifies as being a Buddhist. So it's just sort of reminding us of our reliance on the Buddha and his teachings. And the second two lines could be for all of us. It's expressing an altruistic kind of purpose or goal of our being here together, for however long we're here, to think about, listen to, think about the Buddha's words about happiness, suffering, life, the mind. Why? To take some tools from it. I mean, if this were cooking class, you'd be very disappointed if I just raved on for 2 hours and never gave you even one recipe, you know? So you've got to listen for the recipes. And you might like the recipes, that's cool, because you're the boss, not Buddha. But if there are some recipes, if there are some practical attitudes that you find useful to help you, for the Buddha, develop our amazing human potential, then you take them and use them. If not, that's okay. But then not only that, these tools are to help us not only put ourselves together, but to be of use to others. We all live in this crazy world together, you know. So, expressing something like that. Sangye charang soke chognam la jangchu badu dagni kyatsuchi dagi chernyen gipe sonam ki drola penchir sangye dropa shog Sangye charang soke chognam la jangchu badu dagni kyatsuchi Dagi chernyen gipe sonam ki drola penchir sangye dropa shog Sangye charang soke chognam la jangchu badu dagni kyapsuchi Dagi chernyen gipe sonam ki drola penchir sangye dropa shog. Well, I think you could say that the mind is Buddha's expertise. I think in our culture we don't know much about them. We know all about the Greeks and the Romans, you know, but we don't know much about the Indians or the Asians for that matter, do we, you know? We're really into the Greeks and the Romans and that history. But actually, these Indians are pretty amazing. I mean, it was the Dalai Lama recently that I read who said that it was these Indians more than 3,000 years ago. And Buddha came 2,500 years ago. So that was these Indians more than 3,000 years ago who were the ones who began this extraordinary investigation into the nature of self. That was what they dealt with. And it was they, in fact, who created this really skillful psychological technique that these days we call mindfulness meditation, which is really a very powerful concentration, a technique that allows you to focus your mind, but to really subtle degrees, to levels of consciousness that we don't even posit as existing in our materialist culture, you know. But this is, like I said, it's quite hidden to us in our world. We don't know much about this. But there's this extraordinary technique, and then as a result of that, these Indians were the ones who came up with this. They began, in other words, they began to investigate and look into, investigate and unpack and unravel and develop their actual mind themselves, the actual cognitive process. And so Buddha came out of this amazing tradition of these thinkers, philosophers, meditators, and then maybe 500 years later, and then he diverged in his own direction. Particularly in relation to his own personal experiential findings about exactly who we are, what we are, and what our potential is. In other words, in the nature of self. In other words, it wasn't Jung, or it wasn't Freud 100 years ago, 150 years ago who came up with this stuff. We probably think that in our culture, it was these Indians more than 3,000 years ago. But there's a crucial difference in the type of investigation that they did, and of course the Buddha's findings about the mind is hugely different, radically different view, So, first of all, we'd say that the mind is the brain. The Buddha would say it's not physical. So straight away, we start getting a bit cosmic now because we think of something not physical, that's called a soul or a spirit if you're spiritual, if you're religious, right? But Buddha doesn't assert such a thing as a soul or a spirit. He talks about mind or consciousness. And broadly speaking, in Buddhism, these words are used synonymously. So, even before we say that, though, we should just check quickly, who is this person called Buddha? So like I'm a nun, right? I just sang a prayer. It sounds like religion. I was brought up a Catholic, very devoted. And then obviously as a Catholic, I had faith in God. God is a creator. God also, therefore, because he's the creator, he was the source of the universe, the source of morality, the source of the laws, the source of me, necessarily is above and beyond everybody else, and so necessarily is to be believed, has to have faith in. And I'm not criticising that, you know, but that's just not the Buddha's view, completely different. Buddha doesn't assert a creator. He's not a creator himself, he doesn't assert a creator. Buddhism is this world view that looks into who we are and what we are, just like religions and philosophy and science, and he's got his own particular take on things. So the point is, if he's not a creator, or indeed he doesn't assert a creator, the obvious question is, well, where does this information come from? So if we're religious, we assume the information comes from on high. It's revelation, you know? There's no concept like that. Well, maybe there's something like that, but there's no concept of information coming from some source who created the universe and then using this as your basis for belief. Not like that in Buddhism. The Buddha was a regular guy who became this term a Buddha, okay? So the word Buddha in Tibetan is interesting. The etymology of it's really tasty. The first syllable, the word in Tibetan is the word Sangye, Buddha, which is Sanskrit. So the first syllable of Sangye, Sang, implies the utter eradication from this mind of ours, from this consciousness of ours, of all ego, all fears, all neuroses, all jealousy, all depression, all low self-esteem, all the stuff that we know is heartbreaking, and which we in our culture consider totally normal. In fact, so normal, we think you'd be abnormal if you didn't have them. Whereas Buddha's finding, his own direct experiential finding, again, it's not a belief, it's actually his own experience from his own mind. He has discovered, he has found that it is, and that's what the job he's done, that it's possible to utterly eradicate from one's own mind all of these neuroses, which is a shocking kind of concept. So we're going to look into this. Then the second syllable, gye, implies the development to perfection, basically, of all the good stuff. Love, compassion, wisdom, kindness, generosity, courage, joy, these words. The stuff that we know are the good stuff. So as we know in our materialist world, and also instinctively, even if we don't study psychology, we instinctively assume anger, jealousy, love, kindness, to whatever degree we have any of them, are just natural human qualities. And of course all our models of the mind assert this. So if I'm one of you as a therapist and I come and I ask you to please give me methods to get rid of all ego, all fears, all jealousy, all depression, all anxiety, all panic, all low self-esteem, utterly and completely, and develop to perfection all goodness, love, compassion, wisdom, effortlessly for all sentient beings, I think you'd think I'm seriously mentally ill. Because it just sounds insane, because we don't posit this. But this is precisely and clearly what Buddha's saying. So it's hard to hear this. If you read the Buddhist literature, you know, because they pay great respect to the lineage, all the Tibetans, whoever they are, then it's couched, and certainly in Tibetan, it's couched in these very medieval phrases. So in them, as soon as, because we call it spiritual, we somehow seem to immediately lose our common sense and talk in mystical ways, and we assume it's a belief system, which means we assume it can't be proven. But this is not the Buddha's view at all. If Buddha is this regular guy, then what Buddhism is, if it's valid, and you should check, because there's a lot of weird wacko stuff out there, all claiming to be Buddhist, because we assume with spiritual stuff, you don't need to prove it. Anybody's allowed to think what they like. A person does a weekend meditation course and then writes a book about it, and no one complains. I mean, if you went to one cooking class and wrote a book, you wouldn't get a publisher. Forget it, you know. Because we don't think in spiritual terms that we should verify what we're talking about and show sources and this kind of thing. But this is very much the Buddhist approach. And as the Dalai Lama points out, if you begin to take on board Buddha's methodology, because you want to, you've thought about it, analysed it, and you would like to develop the things that he says we can, which he says he did, and you follow this methodology, well obviously like any methodology, like anything, whether it's music or mathematics or cooking, you go one step at a time, and each step of the way you're doing two things. And this is not the Dalai Lama, this is me, but then I'll tell you what he said. You're doing two things as you go along. Each step of the way you're doing two things. You're experiencing it for yourself, and therefore you're verifying it. So as you go along, as the Dalai Lama says, if you actually can prove that what the Buddha said isn't true, then you must reject him, This is the attitude. We tend not to think of spiritual practices this way, But this is the Buddhist approach. So I always like to say, I never say I believe in Buddhism. I never say I believe in karma, I believe in reincarnation, all this business. I purposely say I use it as my working hypothesis. And that's not just being fancy, that's literally accurate. That is the approach in Buddhism. You take on board, you listen to this person, you read this person called Buddha, you think that's interesting, I wouldn't mind getting less neurotic, less angry, more kind, more wise, sounds good to me. So then I take on board his hypotheses. And so, okay, also for myself, because this is just my mind, since a little kid, you know, always wanted the big picture. Not everybody who's a Buddhist is interested in that, you know, you'll do you can do techniques, you can take pieces from Buddhism. You can be a 1% Buddhist, that's cool. But for me, for some reason, since I was a kid, you know, born as a Catholic, as soon as I went to Mass, I kind of announced to the family I was going to be a priest, you know, not a altar boy, a priest, because they're the boss. You know, I like being the boss. And not a nun either, it was a priest, you know. I could see that had more power. So I wanted to be a priest. And then they told me I couldn't be a priest, of course, I had to be a nun, you know. So I figured, oh, all right, I'll be a nun. So I was totally into God, but always never thought of God as my creator, interestingly. But I went to Catholic convent, 12 years, lived there the last couple because I was naughty. Even though I was religious, I was also naughty. So my mother, when I was 13, she found me walking up and down the main road in our area called Murrumbeena with my high heels on, my mother's high heels and my lipstick from Woolies, trying to seduce Tony Kincotta, the greengrocer's son, you know. So she sent me off to live at school, the boarding school. Anyway, I was there I was being naughty, but at the same time I'd go to Mass 7 mornings a week, so I kind of can't put it together. But I did, because I loved God, I was in love with God, I was in love with Our Lady and the saints and all that. But the bigger one for me is I wanted to understand the nature of the universe, what, why, how, which, you know, why suffering, why this, why that. When I was 15, I heard a Billie Holiday record and Miles Davis, so then I kind of started moving in a social direction away from religious, you know. Anyway, whatever, during my life, it's sort of, for me, it took more of a political kind of way, not as opposed to scientific or whatever. Trying to find the way the world is, what makes it tick, you know. Kind of became a Catholic, then I became a hippie. Decided to sort of give up God when I was 19. Hello boys, goodbye God. And then it was sort of went to London in the late 60s. It was hippie and then radical left and all that business, demonstrating, and then supporting the Black Panthers for a while, and then feminist. So then by the time I was about 30, 31, I wanted something spiritual again, and I bumped into these Buddhists. So that's what I've been doing since, you know, these Tibetans. So I really like the big picture. And so the system that we're educated in is this big Tibetan monastic university system. And so for me, I've always wanted the big picture. So this brings in the whole concept of who we are, where we come from, and the Buddha's view of karma, all this business. Okay. So I find all of that very appealing, and that's my working hypothesis, I put it this way. Which means, of course, that you're engaging in it each step of the way, and each step of the way, hopefully, as you experience it, you're verifying. And then so far, all I can say for myself is, so far, so good, you know? Keep moving. So, okay, the mind then. Buddha's deal is the mind. Everything comes down to the mind as far as Buddha's concerned. Even if you talk about this concept of karma, which is a common word, and it's dealt with in great depth in the literature, that is completely to do with the mind. Karma is this natural law, Buddha says, that runs the universe. It plays out in minds. So let's look at the mind then. So for the Buddha, first of all, these words are used synonymously, mind and consciousness. Second, it isn't the brain. He would suggest it's not the brain. He doesn't argue there isn't a brain. Of course he's a brain, but he's not discussing the brain. And this is the radical difference if we talk about people studying the mind, you know. He's talking about the cognitive process itself. And for the Buddha, the mind goes to far more subtle levels of cognition. Its function is to cognize. They've got the grosser level, which is intellect, thoughts, concepts, emotions, feelings, unconscious, subconscious, instinct, intuition. All of this, the entire spectrum of our inner being, this is mind. The word in Buddhism is used in a much more subjective kind of tasty way, you know. Then the Buddha's view about the mind, his own experiential findings about the mind, from his own mind, his own investigation of his own cognitive process, is that it, as I said, it goes to far more subtle levels that we don't even posit as existing. So anybody who's practiced this technique that's still fully existing today, in the Buddhist tradition, and has been over the centuries accomplished by millions of people coming from these Hindus. This particular technique is known, like I said, generally as mindfulness meditation, which is actually a focusing technique. It needs enormous discipline and rigor to actually accomplish the long-term goal of what they simply call single-pointed concentration. But the point is, we're talking a much radically deeper level of mind. If you'd accomplish what they call this single-pointed concentration, you would look as if you were dead. Because, the level of consciousness that we assume exists in our culture is the grosser level. As far as the Buddhist view is the grosser level, the conceptual and the sensory. But we've got these far more subtle levels. And the reason to access those subtle levels isn't just to space out, There's very good reasons for this, which we're getting to. So the next thing about the mind, which is a shocking concept for us, is it's not the handiwork of anybody else. If you're a materialist, you basically believe that your mummy and daddy made you. They're your creators. Isn't it? That's what we all think. Our scientific views and our psychological views all assert that. So you track yourself back to mummy, grandpa, grandma, and back to the monkeys, isn't it? That's the view in the West. So Buddha doesn't argue we've got mummies and daddies and grandmas, but he would just say our mind, our consciousness, our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, our unconscious, our subconscious, does not come from mother and father. And this is not immediately evident because we so assume that we're the product of parents. So it does take time to look into this and see the Buddhist approach, what it's saying, We'll talk about it a bit more tonight. So on the other hand, if you're a Christian or a Muslim, you are the product of God. But neither of these for the Buddha. We don't need creating by somebody else, he says. Body, no problem. Mum comes from mummy and daddy. That egg and sperm, started in mummy's womb, or wherever it was, fallopian tube. I've learned recently. I didn't know that before. The body is a product of mother and father, which of course includes the brain, the genes, the DNA, all this stuff. But the Buddha doesn't deal with that. He's dealing with the actual, like I said, the actual cognitive process itself, the thoughts, the feelings, the emotions, the unconscious. And so, if they don't come from mummy and daddy, and nor do we come from God, well, obviously the question is, where do we come from? Well, think of your consciousness as like a river of mental moments. All your thoughts and feelings of anger and love and kindness and intelligence and being good at football or music or whatever, all of these tendencies in our own mind. Where do they come from? Well, they come from yesterday, day before. Think of them as an unbroken chain of mental moments. And you've got to get right back to the first second of conception, which is what the Buddha's view is when we actually begin at that first second. So the egg and the sperm you can track back to we know where, mummy and daddy, but the consciousness you basically track it back to a previous moment of itself, of this river of mental moments. So clearly this is not evident. You can't prove it with your eyes, because if it's not physical you can't see it, which is obviously why one needs to take it as a hypothesis first. You can't just leap into it, But eventually, utilising these meditation techniques, we can prove it. That's the Buddha's point. Because we can access these subtler levels of our own mind and see and recognise this. So the mind goes back and back and back. This is where the business of karma, reincarnation, which is an absolutely central piece of Buddha's philosophy. The whole of Buddhism as a big view of the universe would collapse into a heap of absurdity if this is not so. So one takes it as the hypothesis. So the experiential implication of this is quite tasty. Because we can see, isn't it, having this view that I'm the product of mother and father, when things go all the external world broadly, then when we think of what goes on, I didn't ask, we think, we kind of feel like these victims. I didn't ask to get born. It's not my fault. It's his fault, her fault, their fault, the genes' fault, the DNA fault, the chemicals, or whatever, generally speaking, the world out there. Well, the Buddha's view in general is that what's in our mind, in our consciousness, our own tendencies for anger or love or kindness or forgiveness or whatever, they're our own, put there from before. And why were they there before? Because we put them there before. And what were they before? Because they were there before. We can track them back, the Buddha's view is. So already the experiential implication of this idea is that I'm accountable. It's my mind. I came along, in fact the Buddha's view would be we're programmed with our own tendencies from the past, from the first second of conception. As we hit the mother's womb, we're already programmed there, So clearly parents play a role. But let's look into the mind more here, and we'll see where we go with all this. So then, okay, if we want to, Buddha's view about the mind, the final point about the mind, the one that's the radical point implied by this word Sangye, the Tibetan word for the word Buddha, The Buddha's finding, and this is the bottom line finally, this is the purpose, this is the goal, but this is what's assumed by all the practices, all the methodology, is that this mind of ours has this potential to be free of all the rubbish, free of all the fears and all the nonsense, which for him are the cause of suffering, and to be fully developed in all the goodness, speaking really simply. So that's a pretty weird concept, because there's nothing like that, you know, in our materialistic models of the mind. So this too even takes time to try and imagine, because we so buy into the necessity for anger and these things and jealousy and this and that, and they're so utterly normal for us. So to even begin to hear this one really does take thinking, because it's utterly different from how we think. So let's look at that. So again, too, the teachings, in the Buddhist literature, the mind is dealt with in incredible depth. Coming right back from these Hindus, and in the Tibetan Buddhist monastic university system, the understanding of the mind goes to extraordinary detail, you know. And again, we're not discussing neuroscience, we're discussing the actual cognitive process itself. So there's this very seemingly simple, deceptively simple kind of model of the mind in Buddhism. That all the contents of our mind, our mental consciousness, all the contents of our mind, and we indeed have thousands and thousands of states of mind, thoughts, whatever, you know, can be divided into three categories. So simply, we can call them negative, positive, and neutral. But these are not moralistic terms, these are technical terms, okay? So the negative ones, we know them well. They're the ones that we know are heartbreaking. And don't hear this, like I said, in a moralistic way. Hear it, there's like a hierarchy of them, okay? So the deepest of these neuroses, the deepest of these negative states, the deepest of these deluded states, that's the way Buddhism would talk, is so subtle and so primordial, we don't even give a name for it in our ordinary psychological models, you know. And it's a primordially held, instinctive, fear-based, neurotic sense of a separate, bereft, lonely, miserable, poor, self-pity me. And that this is what drives the show. On the basis of this separate sense of a neurotic I, so primordial and so instinctive, what's given rise to is this huge sense of dissatisfaction, which gives rise to a strong craving for something, because you always feel like you're missing something. And the obvious first level of those is the objects of the senses. And then this state of mind is called attachment. Simple, cute word, but it's multifaceted. There's a strong sense of dissatisfaction that gives rise to then, what am I missing? Always thinking something's missing. Then it jumps onto some kind of object, and then what this attachment does is make that object look extremely more delicious than it really is. There's attachment to the cake, attachment to the handbag, attachment to the person, or whatever. It'll jump onto any object, and it makes it look more delicious. It then triggers really good feelings in the body, and then it causes us to possess that thing as our own. Then it causes us to expect it to bring the result that my fantasy attachment is craving. It's multifaceted, this one called attachment. And it's like the motor that drives us. And this too is pretty primordial, pretty instinctive. In other words, it's like a deeply instinctive assumption that I, that fantasy, neurotic, miserable sense of an I, must get what it wants every millisecond. And then on the millisecond it doesn't get what it wants, which is 1,000 times a day, that's the arising of this next state of mind in this hierarchy, if you like, which is really called aversion. Now, a strong aspect of aversion is called anger. An internalized aspect of aversion is called depression. We'll try and go into these. On the basis of these, we have the other dramas, the jealousy and the low self-esteem, the arrogance, etc., you know. Then you've got the positive states. And we know those. Empathy, kindness, forgiveness, love, patience, compassion, joy, whatever these words. We know these words immediately. You know, we know instinctively, we know kind of immediately that the first lot are miserable. You know? We know the second lot are nice. If there's more kindness and patience and love and clarity between 2 people or 1,000, we know logically it's going to be harmonious and everything will work nicely. If there's more attachment and anger and fears and depression between 2 people or 1,000, we know it's going to be horrible. So we kind of know this stuff immediately. But as soon as we think of it as so-called negative, then we get all very caught up in guilt and I'm a bad person, this kind of rubbish, you know? Which is interesting, that the whole approach of the negative ones. They're kind of like the voices of ego. So obviously in our culture, because we know we've all got these, this is the evidence, and we don't seem to have techniques that can rid us of these, then we naturally assume that they're normal. But the Buddha's view, like I'm saying, goes to a much subtler level. And his own findings, his own direct experiential findings, and therefore all his methods, are to rid the mind of this stuff. And there's all these logical reasons for it as you study this stuff in more depth, you know, it doesn't seem evident to us. And then the virtuous stuff, the good stuff, this is at the core of our being. This is what really defines us, you know. So the third category, these so-called neutral states, this is, you know, what it means is they're neither in their nature the positive virtuous ones, nor are they in their nature the negative neurotic ones. So in that, but they're sort of like the mechanics of your mind. Intelligence, concentration, good memory. Whether you're a good person or a bad person, you need these. So it's in that sense they're called neutral. But they're totally necessary to function day to day, every millisecond. These all have to be working nicely. But that's whether you're a murderer or a meditator. You need these working very well. So when you are being a Buddhist, you know, you need to learn this model of the mind, because it's quite distinct. The words are the same. We're all familiar with these words, you know. But the explanation of them, the interpretation of them, being not physical, is radically different. And as I said, in the literature, it's dealt with in great depth, you know. And if you really are sincerely trying to be a Buddhist, using Buddha's tools, you need to study this stuff. Because what you're trying to do is, eventually, become your own therapist. Lama Yeshe, my first teacher, he would say that, be your own therapist. And this is not kidding. You know, it's deeply true. So the techniques that, you know, classically what you do to do this job of learning to know at great depth your own mind, so that you can begin to unpack and unravel this soup of stuff inside us, because we don't really distinguish between them. We've got to get, you need really strong focus and concentration, and that's why you need to do this, you know, one needs to do this concentration meditation technique, which in its nature is not religious in any way. A communist can do it. It's simply a skill to focus your mind, you know. And it's an extraordinary skill if you really do it deeply and well. And what that enables you to do is then step out of this kind of chaos in a much more focused, subtle way, then based upon, say, this is a typical Buddhist, studying this model of the mind in quite depth. You then use this as your basis to gradually observe ever more clearly, to listen to ever more clearly these masses of conceptual stories that are running so quickly in the background that we never notice until they hit the body and become what we call feelings. So we're a big deal into feelings, you know, emotions and feelings. But for the Buddha, they're the tip of the iceberg. So for example, anger. In my life, since a kid, this is one of my natural states, okay? No one taught me. I knew how to do it from the time I was born, you know? Excuse me. So for me, if I use this model of attachment driving the show, this craving, deep assumption that I must get what I want, then anger's really obvious. It's the millisecond I didn't get what I wanted. We all know this. It's explosion. We can see this. It's normal, you know. So for me, I didn't have to practice it. I knew it well. Okay, the Buddha's deal is I would have come programmed with it from before, whatever, you know. But it was a habit I had really strongly. It was effortless for me. So that if you were to see little Robina, she was a child, little Bobsy, as my mother called me, having an angry fit, you'd see this little kid shouting, yelling, screaming, eyes wide, tears coming out the eyes, spit coming out the mouth, and very irrational words pouring out of the mouth, stamping and kicking and punching. Uh-oh, there's Robina, she's angry again. Oh. And then to dismiss, and then 5 minutes later, I would have calmed down, back to normal. Isn't it? That's how we think of anger. Well, if you transcribed my words, okay, and type them onto a piece of paper. And let's just say another one of my sisters who didn't get angry. But let's just say if she looked into her mind, she could see she had lots of angry thoughts. So she wrote down her angry thoughts. And you compare these two pieces of paper, you might even find the person who doesn't express their anger has even angrier thoughts. Because finally, anger is the shouting and yelling is the tip of the iceberg. And unfortunately, the shouting and yelling is what does the harm to others, clearly. But it's just the external expression of what's in the mind. So because in our culture we're totally into the behaviour. I remember one of those poor kids who went around, killing other children. He didn't look like he was too crazy. People just said, oh, he was kind of weird. He didn't seem to behave angrily. He wasn't kind of paranoid because he didn't express his thoughts until one day, and finally, he bought guns and slaughtered a few children. Because if we don't notice the external expression of it, then we don't tend to pay attention. Because what's in the mind, we think that's just what goes on there, So clearly, anger, indeed at the physical level, the verbal level, is intense, and indeed it is what harms others. But it is simply the expression of what's in the mind, and that's called thoughts. If you read that piece of paper of Robina's crazy thoughts, you're reading words, but they're thoughts. So that's called concepts, and that's the Buddha's point. We get below the emotional component using this concentration meditation, and then you slowly, with familiarity, and it takes time, you're able to start unpacking and unravelling this constant stream of conceptual stories, basically. So you could really say that Buddha's like a cognitive therapist, but to quite a subtle degree, And so he's saying we can learn to become super familiar with what seems just like instinctive, uncontrolled ravings inside our head, Or it's like, a football field a mile away. You hear this roar, and it's 60,000 people all shouting at once. You can't tell one voice from another, can you? It's just a sound. Well, that's like our mind. But it's quiet most of the time, until, of course, one of the voices and several of the voices get so strong you can hear them. And that's the trouble. We only notice. I only knew I was angry when I was shouting. One of you might only know you're depressed when you can't get out of bed one morning because you are now inert, because we don't pay attention to our minds. Maybe these days, since Freud, it's marvellous. There's psychotherapy. There's lots of marvellous people around helping us investigate, our thoughts and feelings and emotions. But I would suggest one of the radical differences, of course, because of the different models and the different assumptions, if I were to go to you as a therapist and take typical, materialist therapeutic tools, you want me to help you understand my mind, but you've got to take me back to the past. You've got to look into my body, my genes, my DNA, my chemicals. You've got to know all about my parents, what they did to me, what the Catholic nuns did to me, because we truly have as our basis the view that I'm the product of external circumstances. So we're looking at what it is in the past that happened to cause Robina to be angry, what it is in the past that caused her to be jealous. The Buddha says that's fine, you can do that, but you're not getting to the point. His view is, the anger is Robina's. Yeah, I might have a creepy father. I keep choosing lousy boyfriends maybe. That's not wrong, I do, let's say. But that's not the issue. You can see that, you can see your patterns perhaps. But he says we've got to look into the actual cognitive process itself, my own very thoughts themselves. And the Buddha's view is if I track back my tendency to be angry or jealous, or for that matter, loving or kind or being good at music, I'm going to track it back and back and back until I'm in my mother's womb. And the Buddha's view is I come with these. They might be similar to my mother's tendencies. It might be similar to my father's tendencies. But the Buddha's view is very clear, and this is not evident to us. It's so not like how we think. This is why it needs thinking about if we're interested in it. That I'm not angry because my father was angry. I wasn't good at music because my mother was good at music. My mother was good at music because she had done it before. My father was good at anger because he'd done it before. And then I'm good at anger because I'd done it before, and we happen to come together and exacerbate each other's anger. So the Buddha's view is my own mind itself is what I need to learn to investigate. So, why are you angry, Rubina? The answer is because my boyfriend was mean. The Buddha's view is, why are you angry, Rubina? Well, honey, it's because you're angry before. Why was I angry before? Well, honey, I'm sorry, you must have been angry before. And why was I angry before? Because you were angry before. And why were you angry before? Because you were angry before. And it's like that. So if you keep taking it this way, you start to own this tendency to be angry in my mind. It's my anger. Yes, the world might be horrible. Yes, people do terrible things to us. There's no question about that. But this is kind of intense. And it demands accountability, not guilt, but growing up. This is mine, So yes, keep out of the way of the crazies, if I can. But the Buddhist approach is to learn to become deeply familiar with this process of my own thoughts and feelings and emotions, unravel them, unpack them, and then crucially, as we go, learn to distinguish clearly between the ones that are called positive, appropriate, useful, virtuous, beneficial, and the ones that are neurotic, I-based, and are breaking my heart. Not guilt at all. These are the ones that are causing my pain. This is the Buddhist approach. So it's like you get compassion for yourself. Not, oh, you mean it's my fault. No, not like that. So of course, if you can change the outside world, if you can get better boyfriends, go for it. If you can keep away from the crazies, go for it. But all the Buddha's view is, yes, they are crazy, but they're not the whole thing. It's not only your mother, only your father, only your genes, only your DNA. Your mind, your own thoughts themselves are the central player, actually. And that's pretty shocking. So it takes even to look into it and take this on board as a possibility, it takes courage. Initially it feels like guilt, it feels like you mean I'm the blame. Because that's our instinct, we're into the blame mode, Not like that, no. Because when you really can change your own mind, then that's what, it's not kidding to use the word liberating. And I worked with for many years with people in prison, and I really was so powerful experience in exactly this for me. There's this project called Liberation Prison Project, started more than 20 years ago in California, and I, began because I was editing a Buddhist magazine, the magazine of the organisation I'm part of, that Namdrol Ling, this group that invited me, is part of. So I got a letter in 95, I can't remember, 96, 95, 96, from a young Mexican-American from Los Angeles, Arturo. He told me he was 18, he'd been in prison since he was in gangs in LA since he's 11, and in prison since he was 12, basically. And he was he had 3 life sentences, not for killing anybody, but just the gang activity is pretty intense in LA. So he was in this top security prison that used to be considered against human rights, which is now totally common. It's called security housing units. You're in permanent lockdown. You're in your cell 23 hours a day. So he told me he was 18 at the time, he was in permanent lockdown, they've got a good library there, amazingly, and he found a book of Lama Yeshe, my teacher, and he was very moved by the talk of compassion. So he wrote a letter to Mandala, the magazine whose name was in the book, and I was the editor. So I answered him eventually. And then within a year I had about 40 people writing to me. It was a kind of word of mouth, and then the whole project grew from that. So for me it was a really intense experience dealing with these people over the years. I think probably 25,000 people, while I was running it, wrote to us. We were probably getting 1,000 letters a month. And our main program, it still runs, and there's a nun in Sydney who runs it now, but also from here, it's in the States as well. But the main program we had was receiving letters and then giving people mentors to write to, and then sending books and taking their phone calls and things like that. Visit as well. I visited many prisons also. So of course for me, mostly in this country, and also in Australia, what was very clear, that 99.9% of the people who wrote to us, whom I visited and whom we dealt with, were working class, uneducated gangsters. The rich guys get the lawyers, they don't, and then even I'd say 1% of all those letters we received, educated people. It's kind of interesting. And it seems worldwide, it's kind of fascinating. All the rules and the laws are all about the street people, isn't it? The poor people. Protect them, to protect the rich people from the poor people. It is like that, it seems like that, it's remarkable. Every country is the same. Anyway, whatever. So this fellow, he'd been in gangs since he was 12, totally committed to gang activity, but intelligent, this Mexican boy, so intelligent. So he, he became involved. He started to use these Buddhist tools, and then from there on, I ran it for about 14, 15 years. But the thing that really moved me was these people in these lousy experiences, because the prisons in this country, I mean, they're not as bad as some in Asia, but the numbers in this country, you must know that. You know, the United States is said to have 5% of the world population, but it's got 25% of the prison population. Meaning on this earth, a quarter of all humans who live in prisons in this country, which is a bit intense, isn't it? And apparently there are 50% of the lawyers on earth in the United States. I suppose that's where the business is, isn't it? Anyway, and the sentencing here is quite intense. You see changes a little bit, like in California, Governor Jerry Brown's trying to, you know, there's a law in California, I think it's in other states as well, that was upheld in referendums years ago, that if you'd got arrested and sentenced for the third time, you'd be mandatory life sentence. So there's thousands and thousands, and many of them for stealing videos, not the wackos, not the psychos, you know, necessarily. So many people on this sentence, just overcrowding the prisons. And so one of the things too, especially the young gangsters, is Mexican kids. They're tried as adults, you know, when they were 16. So now Jerry Brown's got a law allowing at least these young guys, and my friend Arturo is one of them, who were sentenced as adults to get a chance to get parole, you know. And he's been there now. He's 37. His hair's grey already. He's now getting a chance to get parole. Never killed anybody, just in gangs, you know. Anyway, it's pretty intense. So the thing is, I admire these people that I know because they cannot change the external. They are stuck in these garbage dumps, you know. Sometimes they're like living in hell, some of these prisons. I can't describe to you. But this is the point. They know, so, okay, he wrote to Lama Zopa one time, one of our teachers, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, the spiritual director of our organisation. When we would send Mandala magazines and other Buddhist teachings to these prisoners, and they would write to Lama Zopa, and he'd write back, and he'd commonly say to them, he'd say, like he said to Arturo, your prison is nothing in comparison with the inner prison of ordinary people. The prison of attachment, the prison of anger, the prison of depression, the prison of jealousy. And that means us. Now that's a shocking concept when you know that he was in a cell 23 hours a day, in a cell that's bigger than a small bathroom. I mean like bathroom with a bathtub, 8 foot by 10 foot, maybe, you know. He's living in there, has been for years. He's now in general population with 2 bunks, 2 guys. They're allowed to have 10 books, no hardback because you can whack your celly, as they call them in San Francisco, in California. You're allowed to have the inside of a pen, not the outside, because you could stab your cellmate. You drink Kool-Aid, no hot drinks, because you could tip it on your cellmate. So it's like really restrictive. You wear your orange jumpsuit. The noise, as they say, is like being in Bedlam all day, like being in a rock concert all day. Maybe 3 hours of quiet at night. That's intense, you know. They kill each other regularly. Well, you put yourself in there with your beloved for more than a couple of weeks, you'll kill each other too, I guarantee. It's beyond inhuman, you know. So there's Arturo in this situation. And there's Lama Zopa saying to him, your prison is nothing in comparison with the inner prison of ordinary people. And this is really the Buddhist approach. As a result of his views about the mind, going deeply into the mind, way deeper, I would suggest, than we even think is possible, as I'm saying, in our world, and way more, in a more refined way to unpack and unravel the cognitive process itself. But just remember your past experiences, you know. So it's an intense process. So the more you do that job, the more you're going to see that, and this is what my friends in prison can say, they know, that one is worse than the outside one. This is shocking to hear. So because they know they can't change the outside, you've got 2 options. You go mad, or you change your mind. Change your thoughts, which means change your view of things, change your interpretation. So a really good example I always use, this woman I read about her, I didn't meet her. I read her memoir. She was in Florida, on death row. Something like 30 plus years ago. She was hitching with her husband and their 3 kids, and they got picked up by 2 guys. The guys got stopped by the police. The 2 guys killed the police and blamed the other people. So they're on death row. He even got executed. I mean, can you even imagine the nightmare? Can you even imagine the nightmare of that? We can see now so many of the people being, DNA evidence showing people are innocent. It's incredible. Got executed for being innocent. She was on there for 17 years, death row. Lost the kids, everything. So I remember reading her memoir, and she wasn't a Buddhist or anything. I think she did yoga and things. But this is my point. She said, at some point, I realised I couldn't change anything. But they couldn't take my mind from me. So I decided, I'm not a prisoner, I'm a monk. I'm not in a cell, I'm in a cave. So I think sometimes hearing extreme things like that really makes the point, And this is the essential point the Buddha's making. There's a saying in Buddhism, if you can change something, hey, please change it. There's nothing moralistic about it, go for it, change it. If you can ask your boyfriend to stop being mean and he stops being mean, aren't you lucky? But if you can't change it, then what? That's the point. And our tragedy in our world, look at ourselves. Look at ourselves, Well, this is the way Buddhism talks in depth in the Buddhist psychology about the suffering of these neurotic, ego-based states of mind, which we consider normal. They're like these vampires that cling desperately and frantically. And so because we're so convinced, let's say when you're really angry, the feeling, isn't it, 1,000,000,000% I am right. And you are wrong. So I remember the same time reading about some other guy on death row who also was innocent, but who went completely out of his brain. He would scream daily as long as he had a voice. I did not rape and kill that woman. He went completely mad. So our view in the West is, especially in something as outrageous as that, he's allowed to be angry. He's allowed to be angry. And if you say to him, well, maybe you can get less angry, he'll go, what do you mean? I'm right. I'm innocent. What do you mean I shouldn't be angry? We hear it in such a heavy moralistic way. So we have this feeling we're allowed to be jealous. I might have a lousy boyfriend cheating on me. I'm allowed to be jealous. I'm allowed to be angry. Well, it's like saying you're allowed to stab yourself. Yes, you are. But do you not notice the harm it's causing you? And that's the part that's heavy, because we can't hear it. And this is the point about these emotions. We're so caught up in the righteousness of them. And don't feel guilty. This is how we are, it's their nature. And we're so caught up because we have this deep belief that I am innocent, therefore I'm allowed to be angry, and you're wrong, you should change. So in other words, we're completely blind to the fact that we can't change the outside, and we're completely blind to the fact that we don't know we can change the mind. So it takes enormous courage. Can you imagine the courage to say, I can change my mind? When the nature of these delusions is we're caught up in our righteousness that I'm allowed to have them. So it's really hard to get past that. It's very painful. So then we are sitting in the torture of our own jealousy, our own fears, our own depression, our own cravings, and feeling completely paralyzed by them. And then the philosophy we have is that I'm allowed to have them, and it's not my fault. It's the dog's fault, and his fault, and the husband's fault, and the food's fault, and the cigarette's fault. Because and our philosophical views reinforce this, that I'm the innocent product of external events. So the implication of this view in Buddhism is very tasty. My feeling is even if you couldn't care less about karma, even if you don't want to think about reincarnation and Buddha's bigger picture of where your mind comes from, who cares? If we're going to have the courage to know that I actually can change the way I think and feel, this is stupendous, So practical, so intelligent, so simple, but so difficult, So this is the essence of it. What's wrong? What's happened? Oh, okay, good. Okay. So listen, anybody got any questions now? That'll do for an introduction. So now you can ask me questions. Any old questions you like. Yes.
So I'm starting to learn a little bit about the lineage of Buddhism. I'm more familiar with Hinduism and Ayurveda.
Yes, yes. I don't know too much about that, so perhaps you have to explain.
So it's their principles of energy.
I think it's a bit different view, but never mind, keep going.
So no, I just wanted to know if because the Ayurveda comes from India and
That's right, exactly.
if they have
That's right.
adopted some of those
Yes.
principles and
Yes.
gone to people's house.
Yes. So, but say the question.
So there's in Ayurveda there are three principles that govern the beginning of the universe.
Okay.
They're called gunas, and they're called sattva, rajas, and tamas.
Yes.
And they are principles per se. The tamas is inertia. They're things that are heavy. So if I were to,
Is this dealing with the physical or the mental?
it's dealing with everything. It's created in everything in the universe. But if you start pinpointing it, pointing it to everything,
Could you speak a bit closer to the mic?
and if you get everything that is made in the world
Yes.
has those three principles.
Right. So was there a question? Because I don't know if
So
I...
I just wanted
Yes.
to know if in Buddhism the mind, when you're born or when you're conceived or
Yes.
when your soul comes,
Yes.
in the process of the creation of the mind,
Yes.
if there's some of those three principles that
I think they talk about it, and it's probably very similar, but quite different, those words. But the Buddhist view would be that they don't use the word soul, okay? The Buddhists use the word mind, which includes these very subtle levels of our conscious being. So they don't use the word soul, and that consciousness comes from before. You know, it's a continuity. It comes into the womb of the mother and the egg and the sperm. And there's these very detailed descriptions of, yes, of how you come into being. But the mind comes from before. It doesn't start. Not the Buddhist view. Yeah. Okay. Somebody else. Any other question? Yes, go. Give the man the mic. Over this way.
I can speak up.
I know, I think they're trying to record it, I'm not sure. So it probably needs the mic. Yes. Wow. Okay. Go on.
In the beginning, you mentioned the Buddhist approach was to move away from the negative and focus on the positive.
No, I didn't quite.
Maybe
No.
I misinterpreted.
Yeah, to learn to look into the mind because they're all there and learn to become deeply familiar with all of this stuff and then slowly identify the neurotic, unhappy bits and gradually, you know, we didn't go to that much, but gradually lessen those and grow the good stuff because that's the stuff that makes us happy and causes us to have good lives and is the core of our being.
But doesn't the focus on the positive breed negative as well? Can you have a positive without having...
How do you mean? Give an example.
Well, for there to be good, it has to be its opposite in contrast.
Why should there be that? What do you
Well, I
think?
would agree.
Hmm?
I would agree, but if there's only good,
Yes.
there's just good.
Yes. Because we don't posit that as possible, do we? That's why you're asking the question.
Because
It's not part of only our scientific view, it's not part of our...
Because I think it's a state of acceptance and surrender. I don't think it's a
Pardon?
I think it's a state of acceptance and
What
surrender.
is?
The state that you're referring to.
I really can't hear what you're saying. You have to go
This-
closer to the mic.
The state that you're referring to?
Which is the state I'm referring to?
The positive.
Well, why don't you say a bit... So, do you have a question? Ask a question, and then we can discuss
It's okay.
it.
I'll pass. Thank you.
What?
It's
No?
okay. I'll pass.
No, don't pass. It's a really excellent discussion.
Well,
It's a really excellent discussion. But I'd like to hear perhaps a question,
so
and then we
my
can discuss
question is,
it.
I heard you referring to the positive, and how the focus should be on the positive.
I'm really, forgive me, I'm so sorry, but I can't hear you so well. Please be patient and persevere.
Okay.
Just speak a bit slower.
So I heard you mention that the focus was on the positive.
No, I didn't say it like
Okay.
that.
Okay. So that's
Would you like me to say what I said again?
That would be great.
And then perhaps you might have a question from that.
this feels like a tennis match more than a conversation.
No, but we're not on the same page, and we
Okay.
need to be.
Sure.
Then we can persevere, and then we can go somewhere. with it.
Sure.
So, okay, I said the Buddha's fundamental finding is that what he would label, what we can call simply here, negative states. The I-based, fear-based, unhappy, jealousy, depression, anxiety, fear, anger. You recognize those things?
Sure.
You see them in the world?
Sure.
You see the evidence of them in the world where people have fights and wars and
Sure.
dramas and murders and rapes. You see that, don't you?
Sure.
The Buddha's view is, from his own experience, that those states of mind are not at the core of our being, that we can get rid of them, and that the consequence of that would be you become more blissful, more clear, more wise, more intelligent, more courageous, more loving, more compassionate, and that is your potential. That's his finding.
And that's the
Good, so on the basis of that, now ask your question.
So doesn't that create the problem in itself because you're striving for something? It's almost an
That's a different question now.
I'm going to pass.
No, you mustn't
I'm
pass.
not
You've got to
enjoying the
persevere.
conversation.
No, excuse me. What do you want us to disagree with you or have a discussion? This is a good discussion.
So
Why are you
so far,
nervous about it?
I'm not nervous.
Okay.
What I've experienced is you're
Yes.
not understanding what I'm saying.
No, that's right. That's why I'm persevering to get you to explain. That's why it's good to communicate. So please persevere. So now your question is that seems like a problem because you're now striving. That's a second point.
So we'll use this conversation as an example. So what I'm
Okay.
doing now is I'm accepting.
Yes, yes.
There's a lot of intensity.
I'm
And
intense,
surrendering.
absolutely, and that's a great
And I'm
quality.
surrendering
So
to this.
have you, and you're wonderful. So now your question is,
Why strive for this positive when it
Yes.
seems that the striving for the positive
Yes.
creates the negative?
why would that happen, sweetheart? Give me an example of how you're
Because the
striving.
very definition to go
Wait,
towards
wait.
a positive
No,
means
no, no.
you're leaving another state.
Okay, so let's say you're striving. Have you got an expertise? Are you good at something? What are you good at?
Apparently not this conversation.
You're doing very well. You're a very good debater.
Okay. I'm not looking to debate
But
though.
it's good to be
I'm
debating.
curious. And so far you've been, I thought you were being attacked.
Nothing wrong. No, you're not
So-
being attacked at all. Not being
Okay.
attacked at all.
Okay.
It's just my Australian accent, darling. Makes Americans nervous.
I'm not nervous.
That's good. So tell me what you're good at, sweetheart.
Business.
Thank you. What else are you good at? What else have you learned in life?
Meditation. I suffer.
What else have you learned besides meditation? Any other skills like tennis, football?
lacrosse.
Good, okay, good. Thank you. So did you have to train to play lacrosse? At some point
Yes.
you didn't know lacrosse, did you?
Mm,
So you
correct.
had to strive to learn the rules and play lacrosse well. Is that true?
Yes.
And you probably became very good at it.
Yes.
Well, same here, sweetheart. You strive to go away from not knowing lacrosse to being very good at lacrosse. Well done. That's exactly the same here. So if you strive to recognize your marvelous potential for clarity and kindness, then you'd have an amazing life. Whereas if we have getting sensitive and worry what people think about us and attachment and anger and depression, we are a mess.
Wait.
Have you not noticed,
No,
sweetheart?
and because I think that breeds the problem right there because you're putting it into this distant future.
Okay.
Whereas there's a state of surrender and
All right.
acceptance that breeds
All right,
it.
darling. Thank you so much. Well, I'm glad you surrendered. You've done a great job, sweetheart.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any other questions? Yes, here, Anna Paula.
I would love to hear from you what's the Buddha teaching with regards to suffering as a result of the loss of the people that we love. So what's
Please forgive me, it's the acoustics here. For some reason, there's
No,
a
sorry.
machine going. The first part of your sentence I missed.
the Buddha teachings with regards to suffering coming from the death of the people
Yes.
that we love? So
Yes.
what's Buddha's point of view on life and death?
On life and death, that's a big question. You mean what happens after death? You mean
No,
that?
I mean what's how Buddha approaches the overcome of that suffering?
So you mean being sad when your loved one dies?
Yeah,
Right, I understand.
thank you.
Well, it's normal to be sad when our loved one dies, isn't it? You know, but we can probably say there's sort of if you really you really say, for example, you completely depend on that person and you feel your life is over because they've died, you become depressed and hopeless, wouldn't you? You'd be so sad and broken-hearted. So then there'd be a healthy way to recognise, as we know, death is natural, impermanence is natural, isn't it? Would you agree? Things change, things die. And so I think looking into that, which seems evident to us, more and more I think we will then begin to notice that we have this deep kind of assumption that a person shouldn't die. We can't stand the thought of death. We can't stand the thought, if we're in love with somebody, the thought that that might end is unbearable to us, isn't it? And so that's the same whether it's your child or your beloved or your mother, you know. So the strong grasping at something, over-exaggerating its importance in your life, would then cause enormous suffering when you lose it. So it's quite a subtle point because we're human beings. We're going to be close to certain people. So to begin to identify the unhappy part of that grieving and to become more kind of healthy and realistic, but it's quite a subtle point, but it's possible. You know. The thing that we're talking about in general is learning to look into the mind in a much more subtle detail and hear the all the stories that are going on in there and learn to distinguish between the unhappy, neurotic ones and the positive, concrete, the positive, optimistic ones, you know. It's quite a subtle job. But of course Buddhism talks about impermanence and death a lot, because Buddha would say, this is not our only life. We've come into this life and we will go into another life. So it plays quite a big role for a person who's being a Buddhist, because you factor in the reality of death and become not afraid of it. And also you realise every day that you are impermanent and you will die, so you live your life much better, and then you accept other people's death in a more, I think, more realistic way. But still the sadness is there, of course it is. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Somebody else? Yes.
Hello.
Hello.
Let me see if I can phrase my question.
Okay.
First, I heard you mention something that, you know, our anger, for example, comes from the past life and the past life. And then that people get into meditative states that they can retrieve some of those reasons. Is that correct? Can you
No, not like that.
So that's my question.
Okay.
Do people in this life can retrieve some of it?
Yes.
One. And second, is that part of the Buddhist practice to try to understand the past, or are we going forward?
Yeah, I understand. The Buddhist view would be, as we progress, using these meditation techniques that enable us to go to more subtle levels of our mind. I mean, this sounds pretty cosmic to us in our culture, but those subtle levels of our mind don't depend upon our brain. Buddhism would assert these subtle levels, you know? And so when you have access, and this is quite advanced, when you have access to those subtle levels of mind, you can indeed cognize phenomena that the gross level can't, which includes the past, and includes indeed the minds of others. It's called clairvoyance. The Buddha would say that's a natural potential of all minds as we really progress, you know? So the point, though, about retrieving, you said retrieving the causes or the reasons for anger, didn't you? See, that's an interesting point, because that's the way we think in our culture, isn't it? I'm angry because my mother did this or my father did that. So we look back into the past, don't we? But that's not the point here. Not the point at all. The point here is, the more we use this technique to concentrate, the first one, then secondly, if you do study the Buddhist model of the mind, what you're studying is the characteristics of these states of mind. So the negative ones, the anger, the jealousy, the attachment, they're these very elaborate concepts. Beneath the emotional component, you learn to recognize how there is a very elaborate conceptual story. So in other words, if we see simply that when little Robina didn't get what she wanted, she got angry. We can see this all the time. So anger, then, if we recognize this response, it's a response to a deeper state of mind, which is called attachment. And that state of mind is the one that says, I want what I want every second. We don't recognize it that way, because it sounds like a petulant kid, but that's what it is. So we all know this ourselves. If you and I really like chocolate cake, let's say, and we just think, oh great, let's go and have some chocolate cake. We go to the cafe, and then we get carrot cake instead. Now you might go, oh, that's cool, I can handle carrot cake, and you proceed to enjoy it. I might go, excuse me, I ordered chocolate cake, how dare you send me, and I get upset, right? Well, that's the proof you didn't have so much attachment. You like carrot cake, but you weren't too set on it, chocolate cake, but you weren't fixated on it. And attachment's very fixated. We all can see it. So then mine is attachment. You couldn't see it till I didn't get what I wanted. And then I get upset. So that's a conceptual story. It doesn't matter what happened to me 20 years ago or a million lives ago. That's not the point. The point is my mind is programmed with strong craving to get what I want, and then strong aversion when I don't get what I want. So when you go more deep in your mind, and you start to hear beneath the angry component, the emotional, and you actually can hear the conceptual story. That's really, how dare you don't give me what I want. And you unpack that. And then you get beneath it to even that one, and then you get even more subtle to the very sense of the I itself. So it's quite a sophisticated approach. It's not looking into the past at all. There's no event in the past that caused it. It's the habit of anger itself that you're looking at, and then learning to literally argue with it. Because it's an assumption. So you could argue, saying, well, why should I get what I want? Perfectly fine to get carrot. You could argue with it. And then slowly you change the habit of being angry when you don't get what you want. It's a cognitive process. Do you see what I'm saying?
It's much more, I don't know if you call it feeling itself than why you became.
Yeah, precisely. That's the one. Exactly. Looking into the actual cognitive process itself. It's very direct. Absolutely. That's
Then
exactly.
you take responsibility.
Absolutely.
As opposed to say, well, it's my
Precisely.
mother or
That's the point.
whatever.
That's exactly the point, yeah. Because if you can get chocolate cake, nothing wrong. But then bad enough not getting chocolate cake, why be miserable as well? It's sort of the way it goes. You might as well change your view. And we do this every day. Buddha doesn't own this stuff. He just runs with it, that's all. He's an expert at it. You could say that. He's not a creator. He didn't make this stuff up, you know. And we do this every day. We work with our minds every day. We change our thoughts. We stop being angry. We won't say that bad word. We make a decision to be kind instead of mean. We're doing it every day. Do you see what I'm saying? It's that, you know. But it's the one of owning it as mine, rather than it's not fair, you know. That's the one that really has to change, and that's hard, because that's the instinct of ego to always feel like a victim, you know, isn't it?
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi.
Hello.
This is the first time that I'm learning about Buddhism,
Okay.
so it might sound a little.
Oh, sweetheart, don't worry. Come on.
So I want to go back on what the other ladies, the other question about
Yes.
death,
Yes.
and like for me, I would like to understand how the Buddhists think about. Do you connect with the people that have died, or is it that I know that you have reincarnations,
Yes.
but can you connect to them, or is it that they just kind of die and then
I understand. The Buddhist view is that there are trillions of consciousnesses, sentient beings, they say, minds, animals, humans, they all have the same status in Buddhism as having a mind. We don't think dogs have minds, but the Buddhist view of the mind is different. It's cognition at some level or another. So the Buddhist view is there are these trillions of minds, and they go back and back and back and back. They're not created, they don't come from some source, and they will continue after death. This is just the Buddhist view. It's gone to in great depth in all the discussions in the literature. And so the law that runs these minds is the law of karma. Buddha says this is a natural law like gravity or botany. And the essential principle of this law, Buddha's saying, he's observed it, okay, is that every millisecond of what every sentient being, let's just think of us or the dog, it doesn't matter, everything we think and do and say kind of programs our consciousness, programs us with those tendencies, those habits. Like, you know, this gentleman doing his lacrosse, for example. The more he plays lacrosse, we all know it, he gets better at it. Well, the more you get angry, the better you get at it. The more you kill, the better you get at it. The more you play piano, the better you get. We kind of know that. It's called habit, you know. So one way of looking at what karma is just we're constantly programming our minds with habits. And so, generally speaking, the principle of karma is that the tendency to negative things, to harming, to killing, to lying, to harming other sentient beings based upon these neuroses, programs our mind with kind of the causes of our suffering, you know. And the more we practice kindness and love and compassion and not harming and not killing, that programs our mind with goodness, if you like, speaking very simply. And so it's a highly complex system, but when we die, our consciousness naturally being programmed will take another type of life. So every sentient being will continue to take other kinds of lives. As you get beyond all this process and you achieve your nirvana, so when my friend there has perfected his goodness and rid himself of all the badness, then he will achieve his own liberation, his own nirvana, and he won't need to take a rebirth. But we're all continuing to get reborn. So we will meet each other, but as dogs and ants and humans. You might recognize each other. We're going to bump into each other again and again, absolutely. From the Buddhist perspective.
Okay.
Does that make sense? As a concept? Or is that a bit overwhelming?
A little overwhelming.
Okay. hang on. But that's not answering your point. You wanted to know if you can communicate with people who are dead. Is that your question, isn't it?
Yes, or more like if somebody close to you dies,
Yes.
and you know, in our world, we
Yes.
kind of feel like, oh, that was a sign from them, or I feel connected
No,
to
exactly,
them.
I understand that. Well, you know, that's an interesting point, because the Buddhist view would assert there are lots of different realms of existence. There are the humans, there are the animals, there are some that are called there's other beings who are very suffering beings, they refer to as spirits, and they're not necessarily very happy beings, and that's like a disembodied type of life. So people who haunt houses, we talk about ghosts and things, that's a type of sentient being, yes. So it's not impossible that you might have a feeling for that, yeah. It's not impossible.
Okay, so let's say when I die,
Yes.
and I lived a nice life, and I was a good person,
Yes.
then in Buddhism, what happens to that soul?
Well, at least you get another human birth.
You get another human.
At least another decent human body, yeah. See, which is what I'm dropping. But the goal is to get past all this. The goal is to get rid of all the rubbish, get rid of all the causes of ridiculous rebirths, and then when you don't need to get reborn, you also, there's a nice analogy in Buddhism that a bird needs two wings, wisdom and compassion. We're talking here the wisdom wing, which is sort of the nuts and bolts of how you put yourself together and how you eventually get rid of all the rubbish and develop all the goodness. But then you go to the compassion wing, where you see that everybody else is in the same boat. So even though you don't need to be reborn, you're very happy to get reborn again and again to help others.
Okay, so one past life dictates the future life.
Well, we're lugging around bank vaults of seeds from countless lives, actually, so it's all a bit complex how it works. But not only what you do now will produce the next, but what you've done in the past will also have a role.
Okay, so, sorry.
Yeah.
So for example, the guy that was in jail or any of these people that have had these really
Yes.
difficult lives, that means that they've done something in their lives before to get them to this life.
Every sentient being, no matter what, has got countless lives, and everything we are at the moment is the fruit of what we've done before. We are like our own creator.
So trying to become a better person
Yes,
when you're
will produce the result.
will
Exactly
produce the
that
result
result.
in your next life.
The Buddhist view would say that being a human is the fruit of phenomenal hard work. There's very few humans, if you compare with the animals alone, there's only 7 billion of us, and you probably have 7 billion mosquitoes in your garden in one summer, in one evening, So there's trillions of, keep the microphone, it's like a keep it. There's trillions of sentient beings. So for us just to get a human body is the result of a lot of hard work. And that's programmed before you even die in the last life. So, so then you take this new human life. But then also, you see, karma ripens, they say, in 4 ways. One way is the type of rebirth. Well, you got the human birth, you kind of won the lottery. But the next one is your tendencies. Well, look at the world. There's some pretty wacky people around, killing, lying, torturing, stealing, isn't it? Crazies. Well, that's the fruit of those tendencies, but they unfortunately ripen as a human. Then the next type of way karma ripens is the way you're seen and treated by others. So you can be a nice person but have really bad things happen to you, can't you? And you can be a bad person, a mean, ugly person, but have everything lovely happen to you. So they're two separate tracks of karma, It's all a bit complex, but this is the Buddha's view is we're not created by anybody else. We're not a random event. There are causes for everything we are, and he says this is this natural law called karma, and it runs in mind. Every sentient being, essentially, is the product of what they have done before. All the happiness and all the suffering.
So what do you say to what you just said? What advice or psychological advice do you give to when you say that somebody bad, for some reason, all these good things happen? Like, if you're a product of karma, how does that even, like...
Well, I give the exact, okay, can you agree that, we can see in our lives, can't we? We've got these two tracks. We've got tendencies in here, and we can have some bad ones and some good ones. Would you agree? I mean, maybe you've only got good ones, I don't know. Maybe you're like him, you've only got good ones, and he plays across as well, who knows? So we can see we've got lots of tendencies, right? Isn't it? And then we can see we've got lots of things happening to us. They're two separate things. So you could have a tendency to lie all the time, but no one else lies to you. They always tell you the truth, or they believe your words. Equally, you can be a person who tells the truth, but no one believes you. So it's kind of like nerve-wracking, So whatever we bring these tendencies, so from one track of having lied in the past, you have the karma to not be believed. But from another track, you have the karma to not tell a lie. So it's just, there's different things. So the point of this for the Buddhist is, I'm sick of suffering. This is the first level. I'm fed up with suffering. Hey, I don't want any more suffering. So conclusion, I must have caused it, so I'm going to stop causing more suffering. And I do want to be happy. So conclusion, you do positive things. It's not a complicated concept, but it's not punishment and reward, because there's no punisher and rewarder in Buddhism. There's no concept of a creator running the show, So you take responsibility and you're sick of suffering, so I stop creating the cause for suffering. I'm sick, I want happiness, and then I will create the causes for happiness. It's up to me.
Okay, that's really cool because I think I kind of get the general concept,
Okay,
which is like
good.
you're totally in control of your own.
We've got to learn to recognise we're not victims. This feels tough because we feel like victims. We feel life is not fair, it's not fair, I didn't ask to get born, it's not my fault. So my friends in prison, I mean that woman, for example, the one on death row, look at her response. She wasn't really a Buddhist, she might have read some stuff, but she decided she could change her mind. Why be a victim, you know? It was outrageous what happened, but how courageous. It's amazing, isn't it?
Thank you.
Or for example, okay, I'll tell you a story. A friend of mine, this is a shocking story for us, this type of thing. 15 years ago or so, Richard Gere, I mean, as you know, is a Buddhist, he invited a bunch of former prisoners to meet the Dalai Lama. He invited 20, all of whom had done some kind of meditation in prison. He also invited people like me who were working with people in prison. And it was a very moving day, you know, all these Americans, some black, some white, Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, you know, male, female, a whole cross-section of Americans. And they had a wonderful day, all communicating, talking about their suffering in prison and blah, blah, blah. They met the Dalai Lama. It was a great day. So they also invited, Richard Gere invited a couple of young Tibetan Buddhist nuns who'd been tortured and sexually abused in Tibet. Maybe you've heard about the history about Tibet, you know, pretty intense. So then these young women, like early 20s, who are Buddhists, brought up all their life with this philosophy. This is the philosophy in the bones of their being, you know? And so they take the view of karma, they accept responsibility. So there they are being tortured and sexually abused just for being Buddhist nuns, for God's sake. And so there they are, suffering intensely, and they're crying, the tears, when they're telling their story. Well, the first thing is, it was very clear to everybody else. You could probably, if you want to quantify suffering, theirs was worse than most people's. But the first point was, it was clear to all the Americans that they weren't angry. Because anger, the Buddhist view would be, anger is the response of a victim. So I'm not trying to be shocking here. How dare you do that to me? There is no reason. I don't deserve it. Deeply, that's the philosophy of anger. Well, they have the view of karma, so they don't have that view. They don't have anger, which is quite shocking to hear. But secondly, at the end, they were very quiet and they said, and of course, we had compassion for our torturers because we realised we must have harmed them in the past. Now that's intense for our ears, but this is the implication of the view of karma. But equally the point is that we never think about this. You know, we never talk about the good things. We never ask, you know, we will agonise, why do bad things happen? We never agonise, why do good things happen? We don't care why, just give me more, you know? So in other words, deep in our bones, we have a very deep assumption that we deserve good but don't deserve bad. And the Buddha would say, well, we deserve both because we created both. So that this view of karma, there's no feeling of guilt about it. There's a sense of real accountability, which brings that courageous view of ownership, and therefore no blame, no guilt, and then compassion even to those who harm you. I mean, that's pretty advanced. But that's the principle, that's where it comes from. Do you understand? That's the Buddhist view. Thank you very much. Thank you. Somebody here wants a question. Somebody here? Yes.
Hello.
Yes.
Well, first, thank you for coming and sharing all
It's a
this
pleasure.
with us.
Yes.
And then I heard you before at the beginning. This is a question about you.
Yes.
You were for a few years on your way or your path to be a
Yes.
nun,
Yes.
a Christian.
Yes, I was a Catholic as a kid, yes.
A Catholic. Yes.
Until I was 19.
So when you are in a convent and you live there, I mean, it's some people call nuns the wife.
I was
of
I was a Catholic schoolgirl. I wasn't a nun.
Okay, yeah, in a boarding school.
Oh,
Yeah,
that
I
was
understand
boarding
that.
school. Oh, okay,
Where-
good. Yes,
in,
yes.
Environment
Yes, yes.
like that.
Yes.
And then you, of course, when you are in this environment, you create or have a relationship with God and you know, a high level of faith
That's right.
on God,
Exactly.
on the angels and
Yes,
the Holy
all of that,
Virgin
yes,
and
yes.
all this
Yes.
huge, beautiful world
That's right.
that the Catholics have,
That's
Christians
right.
have.
Exactly.
So, how was your transition from
Right.
believing and living for God,
Yes.
by God,
Right.
and because of God, to denying God?
I understand.
And how did you end your relationship with all this beautiful world,
I
with
understand.
the angels?
That's so sad. I'm going to cry. That's very sweet. Are you a Catholic?
I was, yes.
You were a Catholic.
I
But it wasn't-
12 years and I was
Okay.
going to be a prisoner.
All right, there you go. So for me, I was in love with God. I loved the saints. I loved Our Lady. Even at the same time, as I pointed out, I was a naughty girl. I was very rebellious. I was in trouble. But at the same time, I had this inner world, you know. I never talked to my sisters about it. They never thought about the same things. It was just my inner world. I read all about it. But then, like I said to you, by the time I got to 15, I was growing up. And then it was in 1950s Melbourne. I didn't even meet a person who wasn't white and wasn't Catholic. I mean, I didn't even meet a black person. Forget about a Mexican or a Cuban or something. Forget that. I mean, English people, white people, you know. So then, and Catholics. I remember we had one girl at school whose name was Feinberg. We said, oh, that's Jewish. That's a Jew, you know. So anyway, in this kind of insular world that I lived in, I was 15, and I found, my mother was a classical musician. I was brought up as a classical musician. She would never let us listen to Elvis or anything, but I heard a record of Billie Holiday, and then Miles Davis. So that blew my mind. It opened me up to this whole new world of black American music, and it sort of, my whole heart opened up, and it became gradually starting to become sort of more like social and political, so I got reading, you know. So that my mind was moving in that direction, opening my mind. And it took me a while. I was 19 by the time I decided it was Goodbye God, Hello Boys. And that was the, you know, the mid-60s. And then sort of after that it became drugs, and then I went to London and was ripe and ready for revolution, so radical lefty, you know, communist if you like, you understand, demonstrating, looking at that philosophy, trying to find that. And I was so into each philosophy I did, I was 100% committed, you know. When I was a hippie, I was a serious hippie. You know, did what hippies did, you know, seriously. And then I was into the communist one, got arrested and demonstrations and this kind of thing. And then into the black politics business, the Black Panthers in the time of the 70s, and then feminist. And I was a radical feminist, you know, gave up all the boys and became a radical feminist. But I was always looking for a way of understanding the world. What is the cause of suffering? Why the world the way it is, basically. That was my kind of evolution, you know. And then by the time I was about 30, I think I exhausted all options. You know, but when I was a Catholic, all the non-Catholics were the problem. And then I was a hippie, all the straight people were the problem. Then I was a real radical lefty, all the rich people were the problem. Then I was into black politics, the white people were the problem. Then I was a feminist, the male people were the problem. And I didn't have anybody left to blame. Seriously, it was very intense. So at that point, I met these Tibetan lamas. And they said, well, how about looking at your own mind? Well, I'd never thought of such an idea in my whole life. It was a radical concept to look at myself. I was blaming everybody else. Do you understand? So since then, that's now 40 years I've been doing that job. And that now includes the Tibetan Buddhist world. And all I can say is, you know, I feel very comfortable with the Tibetan Buddhist world. So I've replaced the Catholic world with the Tibetan Buddhist world. I mean, you could argue from the Buddhist point of view, I've been a Tibetan Buddhist in the past. And therefore it's familiar. That's the Buddhist explanation, you understand? But I love God, I love Our Lady, I still do. But I've got this different philosophical view now, and I mean, I feel my mind's very open to all sorts of things, but I'm very content with the way I'm going and trying to find the common ground in all. You know, I never criticise any religion. I have great respect for anybody who's looking into the meaning of life. I really do have respect, you know. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay. Yes.
So that's actually a really good segue into what I was going to ask about. So
Yes.
I'm clearly a younger person, and it's easy to become like disillusioned with a lot of like social issues and things that, I don't know, when you're coming of age, you start to like acknowledge.
That's right.
So I guess my main question is like in terms of disregarding the external and focusing on like working on yourself and the internal and reaching that point of like self-awareness. How do you apply that to make external changes happen?
Exactly. Exactly. Well, like I mentioned briefly before, there's this analogy that a bird needs two wings, like the. Oh, wait till you sit down. Come here, stay with the mic. You might have another question. So there's this analogy that a bird needs two wings: wisdom and compassion. So the wisdom wing is what we've been talking about so far, kind of putting yourself together, you know, sorting out your own rubbish, your own fears, your own dramas, lessening those, growing your courage and your goodness. And then, of course, what that does immediately is it opens you up and you see the rest of the world. And now that's the compassion wing. Now you're more qualified to see that everybody's in the same boat, everybody's suffering, everybody's neurotic, everybody's miserable, everybody's blaming everybody else. And there is indeed intense suffering. And then you're able to use your wisdom to know how to help others, you know. So that can be in many ways, but it's not that easy. I mean, there I am working with people in prison. I mean, I probably touched the lives of thousands of prisoners. So that there's intense suffering. Like I said, all the working class, the suffering, it was awful dealing with people in prison. But somehow I could see, I wasn't doing political work, trying to change the prisons, let's forget that. Trying to help the people in prison get tools that could help them deal with their lives better. But when you do this kind of work, you can get out there and be a very good political activist, try and make the world a better place. But you get a bit more, with the Buddhist view, you get a bit more, I don't know, maybe realistic, and know you can't make it all perfect overnight, but you do what you can to make things better. You do what you can to stop injustice. But what I find myself, having been an old radical lefty before, shouting and yelling and kicking and screaming and demonstrating, nothing wrong with that, but somehow now, it's for me coming from more courage in a way. You don't freak out so much, and you do what you can. Do what you can to make the world a better place. This is our responsibility, we must. But we can see we can't change everything overnight, and we can even see we can't change anything sometimes. So you don't go crazy with it, you really become more realistic, you know? Do you understand what I'm saying? I mean, the way, I can say for sure that the Buddhist, any work I've done on my own mind, informed my ability to help people in prison. I didn't get caught up in all the dramas and all the politics, because it was a nightmare in prison, you know? You can't do anything. There's no point in trying to get them out of prison. I didn't have money for lawyers, but I helped them in a way that I could, help them become more content human beings so they could do better themselves within their lousy situation, you know. But we must help the world. This is our job, you know. Of course, in whatever way we can. What do you mean? Oh, sorry. Is that what you're asking? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But, yeah. Someone else. Oh, is it time to go home already? What time is it? It's 9 o'clock. What time are you supposed to finish?
9:30.
What?
9:30.
Oh. I talk fast. That is 9:30 already. Go on. Yes. What's your question?
I'm also very new to Buddhism,
Okay,
but
sure.
as a vision, if everybody on earth was a Buddhist,
Yes.
what would that look like?
Sweetheart. No, I mean, forget even that. If everybody on earth first recognized that when you shout and yell and lie and steal and rape and kill, in other words, harm another, first, you're harming yourself. You know? If we even learned that, who would want to do a single thing to harm others? But that's the tragedy. You know, because we're so used to thinking of harming others as being, you're a naughty person, so if no one sees you do it, you get away with it. Well, that's a bit like, for the Buddhists, that's a bit like thinking that when your doctor doesn't see you smoke, it won't affect your lungs because you're not going to get punished. But we know that's stupid. We know that it's a natural law that what you eat and what you do with cigarettes will affect your body. Well, the Buddha's view is whatever you think and do and say, first brings consequences to you. That demands you grow up, and we become so mature. And then we realise, out of compassion for ourselves, we even then want to get to the deeper level and give up the anger and the fears that inform the crazy actions we do. So the world would be a wonderful place if we realise this, wouldn't it? And it's called morality, it's called ethics. It's, you know, it's not being Buddhist even, this is ethics. And that's the basis of Buddhism, but that's called ethics. Taking responsibility, realising whatever I do, say and think will affect me right now, not to mention in the future. That I'm producing myself every day. That's the essence of really the view of karma. And you don't need to talk about reincarnation to say that. Do you understand? I think the world would be a nice place, wouldn't it? But don't hold your breath, babe.
And the second part is that, would it be room for ambition in that world?
Of course there is, but it's got to, you see, the thing is, ambition, wanting something, being rich, if it's motivated by the wish to be a better person and to help others, wow, have as many boyfriends, has as many ambitions, as much dollars as you like. Do you understand? In its nature, it's not negative. It's when it's driven by attachment and craving and anger and neurosis and cheating and stealing that things become a disaster. So it's the motivation that impels it. That's the point. You understand, isn't it? Of course. But it would be not just, you know, in other words, not self-centered ambition, neurotic ambition, I-based ambition. But don't view that as moralistic. That's what harms you. The people who are driven by that, they're tortured. Do you understand? But to have ambition that helps you become a better person and makes you more useful in your world, wow, perfect, go for it. So it's motivation that's the key. Do you understand? It's the same principle. And then you wouldn't be immoral. You'd be a multi-millionaire, but you wouldn't be ripping the earth off. You wouldn't be harming others. You'd be using it for good. Completely not a contradiction at all. Do you understand?
A point that you just said kind of like brought something up to me because I'm Catholic, and there's a lot of things that I don't agree with, so I kind of take what I like.
Okay, cool.
But like Catholicism is based, I mean, I feel like it's based on like guilt. You know, you don't want to do something because God's going to punish you.
I understand, yes.
And in a way, I just kind of, for some reason, it just like clicked to me like, okay, your karma, right? You can't do something because it's going to get you back in karma. So is it, in a way, it's like you're fearful of your karma?
I understand.
So my question is,
Yes.
it's not based on fear, but in a way, you are kind of fearful of your own karma.
I understand. Well, that would be common sense, wouldn't it? If you know that smoking could cause you cancer, I think it's a healthy fear to not want to smoke cigarettes because you don't want suffering. So the difference is the punishment reward mode. Like if I'm in my mummy's household, when I was a little kid, mummy said, don't do that. And being a little smarty pants, I probably said, why not? And we know her answer, because I say so. So it's the same principle, you get punished, isn't it? But the point is with that one, and this is how we are in the world, we don't want to get punished, so we do something and get away with it. Do you see what I'm saying? Because no one saw us. Well, the Buddha's view, that's kind of childish. It's like thinking you get away with smoking because your doctor doesn't see you. But no, when you realise that it's a natural law, that negativity and anger and fear and killing and lying will harm you, then out of self-respect, you won't want to do them. Who cares who sees you? It's not a question of somebody above you punishing and rewarding. So that's the difference. It's similar, but that's the difference. It's a more fundamental personal one, and it brings accountability. No one has to see you. And goodness the same. Right now we want to be seen to be good, so we get rewarded. But the Buddhist view is reward is, you know, the goodness, that virtue. My mother used to say, my Catholic mum used to say, virtue has its own rewards. That attitude is much more self-confident and much more accountable for yourself. Not worrying about what mummy or daddy or God think. It's more, you're in charge of it, you understand? Do you understand?
Yes, yes, I understand, and I really, that resonates a lot with me, and I'm a mom, like everybody here is here, and I want to be able to instill that in my children, not the fear.
No, that's right, exactly. But I mean, I have to say as a Catholic, I never had guilt. I love God. I didn't have guilt. So not everybody has guilt. I didn't even think of God as my creator. I just love the idea of God is everywhere, you know. I kept wanting to try and have feeling. I'd be at Mass, I'd learn the Mass in Latin, I'd go 7 mornings a week. I'd be waiting for a feeling of oneness with God. I'd wait for it. It never came, you know. So I didn't think of him as my creator. I never guilt at all. Anyway, there you go. Who else?
Well, I
Yes,
just
Rita.
wanted to ask, beyond like the concepts, which all for me as well resonate, but talk a little bit, if you could talk a little bit about techniques of how you sort of get there slowly, you know, because it's
I understand. Well, this first of all will sound a disappointing first part of the answer. The first level of practice in Buddhism is do what your grandma says. Behave nicely. This sounds cute and rather boring, you know, because we think meditation sounds so delicious. Whatever, that's necessary. But if you think of it as like junior school, high school, and then university, the compassion wing is university. That's the most advanced, surprisingly. The wisdom, the middle one, university, high school, is where you become your own therapist, doing what we talked about before. But you can't do that until you can control your body and speech. If you go around jumping on every boy you feel like, and if you eat every piece of cake you feel like, and if you lie and steal and kill whenever you feel like it, and get angry whenever you feel like it, how can you possibly work on your mind? Because you're stirring up the junk all the time. So the first level of practice, which is what typical kind of, you know, religion sounds like, you don't harm others. You harness your crazy energy. You learn discipline. But it's very profound when we can begin to see the immediate benefit for oneself. So even, for example, like my family was 7 siblings, okay? We all brought up, we had 8, my mother had 8 babies, 7 girls and a boy. We're all close in age. Like she had 9 kids, I think she had 8 kids in 9 years or something. She was quite busy. Anyway, the point is I'm getting at, we're a totally volatile family. And so naturally when we're together as children, we fought, fighting, shouting, yelling, you know. Then we got older and we had our own lives and we come back for Christmas and we fight again. Because you talk. Because we got blur, you know. So at some point now we're all old. I can say the last 10 more years, we've got this unspoken agreement between us. Because we're all very different. They don't care about my Buddhism, you know. We're all very different. We've got this unspoken agreement. We never talk about each other, bad things behind our backs with each other, which families do, and we never speak about things we don't agree with. So we have a wonderful time together. We are very harmonious. There's genuine good feeling between us, and there's none of that residue of the unhappiness and paranoia. That's just from controlling our speech. So actually it's quite profound. So when you control your speech, then naturally your mind calms down, and then you can begin to do the next level, and that's where you learn this concentration meditation. In the world it's known as mindfulness. There's many variations of it, okay? There's lots of styles of it, but essentially it comes from this technique where you simply learn to focus on one thing. You're training your mind for even 5 minutes, good start in the morning. You sit down, you close your eyes, you sit straight, and you just make a decision, a strong decision. This is one example. I will just observe the breath coming in and out of here. With determination, I'm going to focus on the breath. So within 1 second, you're going to wander off. So you're going to catch your mind, you bring it back to the breath. You wander off again, naturally. You bring it back to the breath. It's training to focus. So that's the technique. There's no magic in that. But what immediately the benefit from that is because you're stepping out of the mess. You're not blindly following every thought, or mindlessly much of the time. Suddenly, you know, one of the signs of success in this is you think you're getting worse. It's because you're not consciously following thoughts. You've got to notice the crazy thoughts because they're raging on the whole time. They never stop. So in the beginning it feels like chaos, and it is chaos. But then that's the technique, and already the benefit from that's fantastic, because you start to listen and notice what you're thinking, and you bring this to bear in your daily life. So when you're driving on the freeway, and normally you're just driving, then a car comes swerving in front, you get mad. But now if you're more aware, not just of the traffic, but you're learning the skill to notice the thoughts. The chatting away that's in there that we're normally not aware of. And that becomes more vivid. That's why you think you're getting worse. You're not. You're just noticing. And that's the basis of the beginning of then learning to listen to them more clearly and start to unravel and unpack all these conversations that are going on. Do you understand? It's a slow process, but that's the method. It goes more deep than that, but that's the beginnings of it, you know. But you've got to control you have discipline first. There's no way you can look at your mind if you're always raging and angry. Don't even try almost, you know. Does that make sense what I'm saying? So it's really practical stuff. And don't hold your breath for quick changes. A friend of mine who's a therapist and a Buddhist, she said it's a really intense work. It's having your hands in your own shit. And that's not comfortable. Anybody who's done any therapy at all knows it's not comfortable. Start to look at yourself. But that's all you're doing here. But in a particular kind of way, you know. What did you mean to say? Good morning. Maybe time to go home. There's enough food for thought. I'm intense, as he says. He's absolutely right. Just my voice is intense. He's right. He's completely right. But I'm not being, I'm just my natural state, okay, darling? And it's Australians. We're sort of very blunt, you know. Okay. So we end with a little prayer. Gone like a dream, nearly 2 hours of it. No, hour and a half really. I was late, I'm sorry. So we call it a dedication. It's just thinking, it's just kind of saying, here we've been, hour and a half or something, whatever it is. As many thoughts, Buddhists would say, as many thoughts as we've had, and no thoughts go astray, we kind of program them into our mind. As many thoughts as we've had is as many seeds we've planted. And so we think maybe we nourish these seeds from this moment forward with whatever methods we use to, you know, become a better human being for our sake and the sake of others. And to, you know, yeah, that first little prayer, all sing to them. And the second little prayer is just making the aspiration that compassion grow and grow in the hearts of all. Que wadi